Hello and welcome to the Art and Cosmos studio, where we are honored to welcome General Nicolas Richaud. Hello, Xavier. Hello. Today we're going to talk about the situation in Ukraine, about whether there will be a breakthrough one way or the other. In March 2023, we discussed this and you stated there was no potential at that time. The Ukrainians lacked the numbers, fighter jets, demining systems and artillery shells, despite preparing this reinforced front. You were right. Today, are we in a situation that is very different compared to that time?
Unfortunately, no, and not on either side. Today there is a kind of balance, because even when we say that the Russians are making progress, it's just micro-tactics. It's just a few square kilometers. But when we looked at the front in 2023 and the front in 2025, it's still very, very difficult on the scale of Ukraine to see a huge difference. The fact is that neither side has the power to break through because we still don't have the numbers. Since 2023, positions have been reinforced on more or less stable roles. The defensive positions are getting stronger and stronger, so it's becoming more and more difficult to break through. So that's going to continue. Unfortunately, today there aren't any major changes or game changers, as they say, that could mean one of the two sides will win tomorrow. We're in a situation a bit like in 1418, basically up until 1917. Since we remember that it was in March 1918 that the Germans finally broke through
Before being pushed back. But is it the inability to concentrate forces? Statistically, the Russians carry out one assault per day every 5 kilometers along the entire front. This outwardly suggests it can nibble away, but doesn't allow for operational results. It's impossible to gather 50,000 men without being noticed nowadays. But we are
incapable of concentrating our efforts. First principle of force elsewhere for a simple reason. The front is 1,200 kilometers long and you don't have armies. Like in 1418, which makes 5 to 7 million people. In 1418, the front from the North Sea to Alsace was about 800 kilometers long. On that front, you had 5 to 7 million Frenchmen and almost as many on the other side. Today, over 1,200 kilometers, you have armies of 7 to 800,000 men on each side. I believe the Ukrainians must have around 900,000 men, while the Russians may have about 700,000. So they have other forces that are spread elsewhere in the country. But indeed, stretching the forces over such a huge front doesn't allow for the concentration of efforts, because you have to equip the entire front. And it becomes even more complicated for the Russians, since now there's the Finnish front. 1,380 kilometers all the way to the far north, where they now have to deploy forces. It's something he hadn't
expected, and that will cause them problems. So, does that mean that Russia's industrial rise is actually a reality? But ultimately, does Ukraine's industrial growth compensate for it, making them roughly equal in the end? So yes.
We shouldn't underestimate Russia. Indeed, Russia is experiencing an industrial rise. They are being helped a lot by the North Koreans and by Iran. You can clearly see, I would say, the percentage of Shahed drones that are launched every day. And on the other side, the Ukrainians are gaining strength, but are still being helped a lot by the Westerners, by the Europeans, and also, it must be said, by the Americans, who have not withdrawn. So all of this creates a kind of balance, just a little bit. The balance of power is in favor of the Russians. We have to say it as it is. However, a breakthrough is not possible, as it demands an immense force. And when you want to break through, you need a theoretical balance of power. It's rarely achieved, but it's usually 3 to 5 to 1. And you need 2 echelons of troops. The echelon that breaks through and opens the door but is exhausted afterward. Then the next echelon rushes in to carry out the pursuit. So do you see the amount of force you need to gather in tanks, men, ammunition and logistics to be able to carry out such a movement? Neither side today has those means.
So, breaking through is one thing. The Russians are rather nibbling away, and exploitation behind that is not possible. It's not possible. But on top of that, after 2 or 3 years, with a front line that has barely changed, today, even taking time, even having the numbers, can we imagine being able to get through all these minefields, all these trenches, and all the preparations that have been made? Nothing is impossible.
After 4 years of war, the Germans broke through in March 1918. By gathering the forces returning from the Eastern Front, since they had made an armistice with the Russians. But we must not forget that since 2023, as I was saying, the front has become even stronger, the defenses have become even stronger. And above all, the Ukrainians have become specialists in deep combat, that is, delaying actions where they trade territory for time. When you can't achieve superiority, when you have to fall back, you inflict the maximum losses. It's a war of attrition. And so that's truly in depth with several strong defensive lines. So it's going to be very, very complicated. That's why I don't believe it. Despite a likely offensive, I think the Russians will try their luck in 2025 from what we can see. I don't believe the Russian forces have the numbers to reach Kharkiv, for example.
So they won't stop because of fatigue or attrition, unless there's an economic or military surprise. But that seems unlikely politically, at least in Russia. So for you, there will still be an attempt this year like they did in Kharkiv last year? Low probability of success, I think.
Low probability of success. The risk is huge. If it happens, of course, if he breaks through afterwards, we can rush in. So we've seen examples in history, indeed, where it turns into a debacle. From May 10-13, 1940, the French line was penetrated in a week. They reached the English Channel, but I think today the possibility for the Russians to break through, for example, we see them concentrating with several tens of thousands of men east of Kharkiv. Seems unlikely to me.
It's unlikely, but not impossible. However, could the Ukrainians, if by good fortune, Europe doesn't have reserves because they produce and immediately supply Ukraine. If the United States begins supplying Ukraine tomorrow, the situation could change. 2,000 cruise missiles, 8,000 tanks, they have them in reserve. About 100 F-16s. Is it there? On the other hand, that would be enough of a trigger to allow Ukraine not just to stop Russia, but to go on the offensive.
I think it will be complicated for exactly the same reasons. Because even if you have the equipment, you still need manpower. And manpower. I remind you that a battle is won on the ground. You can have drones, planes, and so on. Support is good, but at some point you need boots on the ground. Without enough people on the ground, it will be complicated. Now we can clearly see that this is a problem shared by both the Russians and the Ukrainians. It's about general mobilization and the ability to mobilize. Russia, with a population of 140 million, could theoretically mobilize 5 to 10 million people without any problem. But even they aren't mobilizing 1 or 2 million people. Without tanks to equip them, it's complicated. So even if the Ukrainians, for example, receive tanks tomorrow, receive equipment and so on, there remains the problem of what we call manning in Italian, that is, how to staff this equipment with tens of thousands of people. And I also remind you that if you want to scale up, the Ukrainian army, it's not just one man. Equipment, rifle, uniform, etc. You also need to set up logistics and headquarters. Headquarters refers to lieutenant colonels and colonels with 25 years of experience. So you don't just find that under a horse's hoof. So you'll be forced to stretch the army in order to form new units, and that brings weakness. So it's not impossible, but it's very complicated. It takes a lot of time to rebuild forces
that don't exist. So if we just look at the probabilities, the statistics, another attempted assault by Russia. Rather a failure, or in any case progress that is so limited that it doesn't manage to break through the front and achieve a military victory. At that point, out of exhaustion, both protagonists would be forced into a ceasefire, which is not the current situation. It's not necessarily the case, because I think
that one of Vladimir Putin's immediate objectives is to complete the oblasts that haven't been fully conquered, meaning those 4 oblasts, 5 with Ukraine, which are de facto integrated, not officially, not legally, into the Russian Federation. So they have almost the entire Luhansk Oblast, so we can say that it's pretty much secured for them. But the Zaporizhia Oblasts,
Donetsk, Kherson,
are absolutely not.
There remains
around 25-33% remain to be conquered in each of those oblasts. And I think that Vladimir Putin, as we see today in the negotiations with Trump or with Nanternet, will not stop before reaching these immediate objectives, which are truly to align these oblasts with the constitution as it
was amended. Militarily speaking, now, when we look just at the tactical side, when you look at the evolution of the methods of deployment and engagement of forces on the ground, do you feel that the Russians have learned when we continue to see assaults? Are they still using somewhat Soviet methods? It's a bit of both.
Because they've learned, yes, apparently they've learned, for example, with drones. I think they're almost on par with the Ukrainians today.
Yes, very clearly.
When you see, for example, the kamikaze drone, which is a loitering drone, The Lancet, for instance, is an inexpensive yet highly effective weapon costing only tens of thousands of euros. And then now we see the fiber optically guided drones, which can't be jammed electromagnetically and cause enormous damage. So yes, they have learned. Yes, they have learned. On the other hand, tactically, I'm always a bit amazed by this dispersion of efforts with micro-attacks along a 1,200 kilometer front where they try to gain a few square kilometers, as if they couldn't decide which part of Ukraine they wanted to conquer first. And so this dispersion causes losses. Because when you have a few dozen men attacking a place, they're more likely to be massacred than if you had more. 200,000 attacking and overwhelming the position, which actually allows the breakthrough at that point. We don't see that, so it may be due to the mediocrity of the Russian troops. I don't know if it's maybe because their armored equipment is running out. They don't have the means to fully regenerate. They destroy or damage more than they're able to build, or else they use old equipment, or the guys go on foot, so it's clear that there's nothing that allows for a breakthrough. And tactically, it's still basically frontal slaughter, a bit like in 1914-1918. We don't see tactically or even operationally a revolution in thinking among the Russians.
So in the end, the area where they've made progress is in achieving attrition against the Ukrainians. It's with drones, but ultimately in their method of employing and engaging forces to carry out
assaults. They've definitely made technical progress. The army that entered Ukraine in 2022 has made progress in various areas. But in terms of overall tactics and the ability to impose their will on the enemy, because that's the problem of freedom of action. Ultimately, it's also one of the principles of war, freedom of action. You must impose your will on the enemy. That they're struggling despite being a nation with 3 times the population and wealth. 70 million square kilometers, absolutely colossal wealth. And they're not able to overcome Ukraine. But Ukraine, make no mistake, is struggling.
Do you think we'll have a ceasefire this year?
Well, it's possible, but we
are not fortune tellers.
We're not fortune tellers. I mean, we're not fortune tellers. It's possible, but I've had doubts since the beginning. Based on the negotiations, I believe his immediate goal is to reach his oblasts. The ultimate goal might be the conquest of Ukraine, we'll see. But for me, his immediate goals are truly the conquest of the oblasts. Plus, it's basically a must-have.
For the Russians, it's a prerequisite for the ceasefire.
The ceasefire, as we've seen, is you withdraw first from there and then we negotiate. A ceasefire is typically a military gesture to silence weapons for negotiations. He says politically, you will withdraw from the oblasts and then he will end the ceasefire. That's proof that he doesn't want to negotiate, and so if he doesn't want to negotiate, he's going to fight. Until these oblasts are aligned, until the front line is aligned with the administrative borders of the oblasts. And so I still have serious doubts that we'll achieve anything lasting this year, even if there's a temporary ceasefire, etc., etc. But everything will also depend on the United States of America, because we don't know what they are going to do. Europe seems to be gradually getting ready for battle, but too slowly and in an uncoordinated way. On the other hand, it's really Trump who holds the key to all of this. If they help the United States support the Ukrainians in a massive way, maybe that could push Vladimir Putin to negotiate. But under the current atmospheric pressure conditions, as I often say, I don't see a ceasefire in a
immediate future. So a near future with a ceasefire, it would either be massive aid to Ukraine or massive sanctions on Russia. And only the United States can decide that.
And above all, massive aid to Ukraine. I don't think the sanctions, are something very important. They're economic sanctions, but they're a slow poison. And the pace of economic sanctions is absolutely not the pace of war. The pace of war is something immediate. You need troops, you need ammunition, logistics, tanks, planes, and so on. Whereas from an economic point of view, when sanctions are imposed, it takes 5 to 10 years maybe for them to have an effect. It will weaken Russia. It certainly prevents it from stepping up its efforts. So people say it's useless. But it has clearly helped to slow it down, to hold it back by the shoulders, meaning imagine the power of Russia if there were no sanctions today, most likely. But for the rest, indeed, the sanctions will not lead to a
test on the
fight. I don't believe it. On the other hand, a massive aid package announced by saying, since you don't want to negotiate now, we're going to massively help Ukraine with long-range weapons. Without restrictions, I think American support would have an effect on Russia. However, I don't see the United States under Trump's leadership heading in that direction.
Well, we're going to keep having a few thousand losses per week, as if nothing's happening. About 1,000 a day, it seems, roughly deaths.
Wounded, etc. At least several hundred on the Russian side, according to
Italian side, even if they are.
defensive, most likely.
Well, Gerald, thank you very much. See you soon. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you at the RN Cosmos studio.